Tonight, the North Olympic group of the Sierra Club has Will and Chip Freund with us. Um, Chip, when he was 18 years old, was a student conservation association uh, volunteer who was up in the Olympic Mountains and had the occasion in 1982 to document the Blue Glacier, which is the headwaters of the Hoh River. And knowing about climate change, he decided with his son to come back and to document that glacier in 2022, 40 years later. Uh, and as Chip said in the film, he knew intellectually that things had changed, but he wasn't prepared for the extent of the the loss that he encountered, um, seeing the extent of the loss of the glacier. Um, so uh, we have the filmmaker with us. We have the father of the filmmaker and the once 18-year-old Student Conservation Association volunteer. And just to get us started, I think Chip, you made a really important point when you mentioned that um, we can pick up the newspaper, we can watch the TV, we can hear about climate change, but how do we make sure that people really get the message, really viscerally, emotionally feel what's going on, that it's not just some abstract thing that's happening out there?
I'll let you
I'm,
start with this one, Dad.
Yeah, I think I'll actually take a page from your book, Will, and that the way that we get past the cultural divides, and thankfully, I would say that we had a period of time several years ago where there was an awful lot of denial going on. There's less and less denial. It's still there, but less. But I think a way that we get through that is by telling stories and telling personal stories. Um, and my inspiration for this project came from Will's climate change story. I'll give him a little plug. He did a kayak trip up the intercoastal from Miami, Florida to Norfolk, Virginia, interviewing coastal communities about how the coast has changed and what climate change means to them in a documentary film called Climate, what am I say, Connected by Water. Which is on YouTube. I encourage you to take a listen and watch that. But that whole idea of connecting people with stories, I think, is a key part of it. And for me as a photographic artist, this just seemed like a logical way for me to share my story. I saw the glacier in 1982, and let's go back and see what it looks like in 22. So all of my photos ended up getting printed up as large canvas prints, and there was a exhibition at the local art center here, and I'm looking for other venues that would like to host the exhibition. And so if you know of any, wherever they may be around the country, I'm happy to learn from you what that might be. But sort of a long-winded answer to your question, Peter.
well,
What
it's
you
it's
asked.
a good answer because I think you you posed in the film, now what do I do? What do we do as individuals once the realization strikes home that things are amiss, things are not the way they should be? And I think telling stories is a really important part of that. And Will, that's your what you're doing. Could you talk a little bit about telling stories?
Oh, where to begin? Stories are one of the most important things that we do in our lives. And also it's one of the things that we're all best at. That we as humans have been storytellers since the very beginning, and I think we've all kind of gotten a little shy on storytelling. Everyone is a storyteller and everyone can be a really good storyteller. I'm sure a lot of people could, imagine a get family gathering and, telling you about, oh, you remember that one time? This is those kinds of stories, that we can all be storytellers, and it all just starts with finding what interests you and what, drives you. And so in my mind, um, I realize that climate change can be hard to talk about. I realize that climate change is also really complicated and it's a lot to unpack, and that numbers don't change people's minds, but stories do.
Yeah, I'm struck by how, we could have had an event this evening where we had two or three scientists talking about climate change. Or we could have shown this film with the glacier before and 40 years later. And I think the story for us, we are, we do pay attention to stories and how they're told, and using film and using photography to tell stories, particularly stories about changes in the environment. I've All of us have at some point or another realized how much everything has changed. I remember when I lived on the East Coast, I was very familiar with the Chesapeake Bay. And when I first moved there in the late 1970s, the the oyster fishery on the bay was just going gangbusters. You could go downtown Baltimore and get a half dozen oysters on a plate. They were huge, they were fresh, they were out of the bay that morning. By the time I left, about 30 years later, the oyster fishery was dead. And that is, and those stories can be told. Um, and having people relate those stories, to talk about, to use photography about what did it look like when these fisheries were so plentiful, and that it was taken for granted, and what do they look like today, and going out and finding that, well, you can't oyster this bed because it's polluted, or you can't oyster where for the last 100 years you did because there are no oysters there. Um, and in the Pacific Northwest, we have a unique issue with climate change because the acidification of Puget Sound and the waters is a direct threat to the continued calcification of the shells that oysters and shellfish need to live. Um, so it's happening here too, and I think finding people who can, like your dad, people who are old enough, like me, to kind of talk about what it was like. What did we see, and to bring that story home. So I think that's great. Darlene, you have a question.
Well, out here, it's the Pacific Northwest have lost their trees over the centuries, which is a major issue. But here in Washington State, as well as in North Carolina, we have these concentrated animal feed operations that are terrible for the environment. And beyond that, as long as there are wars and all these bombs are going on, this is pollution. And that is circulating the globe. That stuff goes up in the air and it moves around. And and they can talk about cars and that, and yeah, that's a problem. But the bombs, the wars are significant in changing the climate. Till we change that, I don't know.
Well,
Well,
that was really brought home to me, Darlene, during the first Gulf War when the oil wells in Kuwait were lit afire.
Yeah.
And here we are putting solar collectors on our roof, maybe driving fuel efficient cars or buying electric cars, recycling, trying to do good things. And, there's hundreds and hundreds of oil wells that have just been lit ablaze because a, it was a war. So that's one of the stories we don't tell. and I think it's a big issue that's kind of hidden behind all of this. Um, I want to
And
open it for questions from everybody else. I didn't see anything in the chat, so just raise your hand. And Bob,
Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask Chip if he's interacted with glacial geologists or glaciologists, whatever you want to call them, about the normalcy of what's happened at the Blue Glacier here in the lower 48. Because I recall traveling a couple different times to Glacier National Park, and they have a pictorial setup that shows what the glaciers were like back in 1910 and 1930, and you can see them today, and there's again quite a bit less, whether it's 34% or 50% less. But I just wondered if you interacted with some scientists that study glaciers, and this is a norm, if you will.
I did. I wanted to get hopefully connected to the ongoing research that had been going back in 1982, but they closed the Glacier Research Station and pulled the box off the top of the snow dome. I don't know what year that was, but they haven't been studying it. But I contacted folks at the University of Washington, had some good email exchanges with a couple of the professors there. Their glacial research has now shifted to the Cascades. They haven't really been looking at the Olympic Peninsula for a while. And that 34% number I quoted was from a National Park Service funded research that actually, I think instead of being 40 years, I think it was only about 30 some years, because it was a shorter time period. And that was the most recent research I was able to find. But I think to your broader question, I think we're seeing across the globe, all alpine glaciers are radically receding at rates far in excess of anything that we've seen in the geologic record. So it can clearly be mapped to the dawn of industrial revolution and our ever increasing consumption and burning of fossil fuels, that pushes it back. And I think the Olympic Peninsula is particularly susceptible because it's some of the lowest altitude alpine glaciers on the earth. I mean, you look at Blue Glacier, it's only about 5,000 feet above sea level. We've got mountains here in North Carolina that are, over 6,000 feet, and you'd never think of a glacier here. So yeah, I don't know if that was specifically the kind of thing you were looking for, but yeah, it's pretty universal experience right now.
Yeah, thanks.
yes, Steve.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Yep.
Yeah, I think what also needs to be addressed is some of the policies that the park system itself has in place right now. I also worked for the park. I was worked seasonally back in the 80s and early 90s. And just for one example, recently they paved the Spruce Railroad Trail. I remember what it was like 30 years ago. And now there is no way for wildlife to access Lake Crescent without having to cross asphalt. Okay. That's just one example. But, the way we are doing this, the way we are, quote, managing the park is not protecting it. It's, if anything, it's exacerbating the situation. And nobody's talking about this. Okay. Everybody's applauding about how now we could, you go there on a weekend. I've yet to go on that trail since they paved it because I remember what it was. But from what I hear, it's flooded with people on electric bikes on the weekends. And I'm sorry, I like wilderness. I mean, where does it end? Are we going to pave a trail up to the summit of Mount Olympus? I don't know. What is the goal here? What is the park trying to do? It's a question, but I
Uh,
don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll I will kind of give a roundabout, in that I think, in my personal opinion, I think national parks are overhyped and that we need to go and visit our local parks more. Um, and we saw this during the pandemic that there was an absolute flood of people traveling to national parks, which I get. But also at the same time, we have some pretty magical parks in our own backyards, and they need some love too. Because also, that's a lot of our ways of spreading out our impacts on the natural world is by going to several different places and not all just going to the few places that make the big social media hits. Um, if I had to guess on why they're paving that trail is for their ways of addressing accessibility, for people in, potentially wheelchairs or other mobility devices in getting to those. I can't say specifically what that trail looks like. But I think that's a really great point though, Steve, of, at what point does it stop? And I don't know. I think,
There's plenty of pavement. There,
yeah,
there are plenty of roads. There are plenty of sidewalks. What's left for wildlife? Okay.
yeah,
They need access as well. You
yeah,
know, I mean,
I'd like to add a slightly different perspective on our national parks, which is to say they're horribly underfunded to the tune of billions of dollars, and that they've just in the budget negotiations where extreme members of Congress are holding the federal government hostage. Um, the parks budgets were even further reduced. There's a backlog of maintenance. There's an absence of rangers and people to have eyes on the park, eyes on the trail, ensure that there's no poaching, ensure that there's no vandalism, to ensure that there's no danger to visitors. Um, the facilities are old. They're just old and in need of restoration. And this backlog has been growing over the decades. So we love our national parks to death, but are not funding them. And part of the problem with the parks being able to protect the wilderness that they're entrusted with is just not having the resources to do it.
I mean, it's a complicated issue. And it's like this and so many other things. And like, I mean, climate change is a great example of this, is that like there's not a one solution, there's not a singular solution for a lot of this. And that's, even more so in climate change, of how to address it and where it's being addressed and who it's affecting. I mean, it's pretty clear that it's affecting marginalized communities and Native communities, Indigenous communities more than anyone else, and they're the ones that have, had the least impact on it. Um, but I think more than anything is bringing attention to these issues is kind of a first part, so that we can then, you know, as we are realizing that our national parks are underfunded, having the ability to, call our Congress people, write to the people that are making those decisions to see how we can better make those changes. And if we can't make them at the national level, support our local parks as well.
Um, I was struck, Chip, by the mention that at Glacier National Park there are before and after photos of the glaciers. And it would seem to me that your photographs would be a natural for a um, um, some type of signage at the Ho trailhead, but also at the park headquarters in Port Angeles. So I wonder if you've had any contact with the Olympic National Park in terms of producing some type of visual educational material that people could see when they get to the park and they start to walk down these trails.
Yeah, I have. and they have some material already in play, going back to the 1800s even, in terms of photographs. The challenge that the park has is they don't have any good venues for, an exhibit of the photos that I have. So that there just isn't a really good venue in the park itself. I've been in touch with, I'm suddenly blanking on it. There's an art center in Port Angeles.
The
That
Fine Arts Center?
possibly, I have to go back and look at my notes. They've been hosting the Terminus Project, and if you haven't checked that out, I encourage you to. The National Park Service, in conjunction with the Art Center, put out a call for art in all media, to, talk about the the ending of the glaciers, if you will. And I've only seen the online pieces of it. It hadn't gone up when we were out there, and of course I haven't made it back since it went up. But I was hoping that they might have some interest, and I traded some emails with their executive director, and no immediate chomping at the bit for it.
Well, the park has a little theater, you might know, at the visitor center. They show films in there all the time. I
Yeah.
think that would be
Don't
a
mind
stunning
have a large,
venue for your film.
Yeah.
Well, I know when you approached us initially, you were also asking us, did we know of venues where this film and where these photographs could be shown? And we haven't forgotten that request, and we will keep that certainly in mind. And I'm hopeful that this film could be shown and viewed more widely on the peninsula. We do have film festivals, and we have local theaters that are very responsive to community-related stories like this. I think we need probably to wrap it up because we need to go into our regular business meeting. I know you are now looking at it's going on 11 o'clock for you guys
No
in,
worries.
in North Carolina. I want to thank you so much for not just being here tonight and showing the film, but for creating the film, for going back to create the story, to tell the story. Um, and it's exactly those kinds of stories that are so important to the work that the Sierra Club does, that work that anybody who's concerned about the environment does, whether they're doing it through an organization, through a land trust, or through an Audubon group, whatever their engagement is. These stories, I think, can motivate us and help us form a community of a consensus in the community about actions that need to be taken, where just kind of the debates in Congress, the debates, out there in social media and the press don't quite do that. But I think stories like the one you've just presented actually help us, help motivate us, and help us as a community figure out how to come together to address these issues. So thank you again, Will. Thank you again, Chip.
I
And
think they just put something in the chat.
Just dropping our websites in there.
oh, great. Thank you.
BlueGlacierThenAndNow.org, and you can find my work at willthefourth.com as well. I do want to specifically shout out, everyone can cross their fingers. This film has been entered to both the Seattle Film Festival as well as the
Oh,
Port Townsend Film Festival.
wonderful.
So you can cross your fingers, and
Yeah.
maybe I'll be coming out your way sometime later this year.
Well, that would absolutely be great. So keep us posted on that. And
Absolutely, will do.
we wish you a lot
And
of
thank you to everybody that joined us tonight. We really appreciate it and hope you learned.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.
thanks,
Thanks
everyone.
for your interest in the project.
Thanks.
Thank you.